Okay, before you scroll past this, give me 30 seconds. That's it. There's a specific kind of tired that comes from being around people all day and still going home feeling completely unseen. You can be in a crowded room, on a group chat that never stops buzzing, surrounded by family who love you in their own way, and still feel like nobody actually knows what's going on inside you right now. That particular ache doesn't really have a name people use casually. It's not the same as being alone. You can be surrounded and still feel invisible. If that's familiar, keep watching, because the next few minutes get into something I don't think gets said enough. Breathe for a second. Not a big production of it. Just notice your shoulders, let them drop if they've climbed up toward your ears, and give yourself permission to actually be here instead of half watching this while thinking about 6 other things. Here's something I want to say plainly, right at the start, because I don't want to bury it under 10 minutes of build-up. You are not invisible. Not to everyone. Not to everything. I know how that sounds when you're the one sitting with the feeling. So stick with me, because I'm not just going to say it and move on. Okay, before you scroll past this, give me 30 seconds. That's it. There's a specific kind of tired that comes from being around people all day and still going home feeling completely unseen. You can be in a crowded room, on a group chat that never stops buzzing, surrounded by family who love you in their own way, and still feel like nobody actually knows what's going on inside you right now. That particular ache doesn't really have a name people use casually. It's not the same as being alone. You can be surrounded and still feel invisible. If that's familiar, keep watching, because the next few minutes get into something I don't think gets said enough. Breathe for a second. Not a big production of it. Just notice your shoulders, let them drop if they've climbed up toward your ears, and give yourself permission to actually be here instead of half watching this while thinking about 6 other things. Here's something I want to say plainly, right at the start, because I don't want to bury it under 10 minutes of build-up. You are not invisible. Not to everyone. Not to everything. I know how that sounds when you're the one sitting with the feeling. So stick with me, because I'm not just going to say it and move on. I actually want to walk through why. Loneliness has this way of lying to you quietly, without announcing itself as a lie. It doesn't say, "You are alone," directly. It says smaller, sneakier things. Nobody would notice if you disappeared for a week. They're just being polite when they ask how you're doing. Everyone else has people who actually get them, and you just don't. Those thoughts feel like observations. They're not. They're loneliness talking, and loneliness is not an honest narrator of your actual life. Maybe you've gotten good at hiding this. Maybe you're someone people would describe as fine, easygoing, low maintenance. And underneath that, there's a version of you that hasn't felt truly understood in longer than you'd admit out loud. That gap between how you're perceived and how you actually feel is exhausting in a way that's hard to explain to anyone who hasn't lived inside it. I'm not going to pretend this feeling just evaporates because someone on the internet told you that you matter. That would be insulting to how real this has been for you. What I do want to offer you is something a little different, not a quick fix, but a reframe that might actually hold weight if you let it. Stick around for the next part, because I think it's the piece that actually changes how this feels, not just what you think about it. There's a concept that shows up across a lot of spiritual traditions, and the language people use for it is divine order. The idea that what looks like scattered, disconnected, even painful events in your life are actually arranged, even when the arrangement isn't visible to you yet. Archangel Michael, in the way scripture and tradition describe him, is often associated with protection and clarity in the middle of chaos. Not removing the chaos necessarily, but standing guard within it, making sure what looks like disorder from where you're sitting isn't actually disorder at all. I want to be careful with this idea, because it can get twisted into something lazy if you're not careful with it. The version where someone just says, "Everything happens for a reason," and uses that to wave away real pain without ever sitting with it. That's not what I mean. Some things that happen to you are genuinely just hard, without a clean lesson sitting underneath them. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But there's a difference between "everything happens for a reason" used as a way to dismiss pain, and things are happening in an order, even when that order isn't obvious yet, used as an actual framework for understanding a season of loneliness. The second one doesn't ask you to stop feeling what you're feeling. It just asks you to consider that the isolation you're in right now might not be the permanent shape of your life. It might be one piece of a sequence that hasn't finished unfolding. Here's where this gets specific to loneliness, because I don't want to keep this abstract. Sometimes a season of feeling unseen comes right before a season of being deeply known, not by everyone, never by everyone, but by the right people, the ones who actually see you the way you've been wanting to be seen this whole time. And the strange thing about that sequence is that the lonely part often has to come first, because it's in that lonely stretch that you figure out who you actually are without an audience. You stop performing for people who weren't really watching anyway. You get quieter, more honest with yourself, less interested in being liked by everyone, and more interested in being known by someone. That's not a consolation prize. That's actual preparation, even though it doesn't feel like preparation while you're in the middle of an empty Friday night wondering if anyone would notice if you just disappeared for a while. Stay with me, because there's a specific story I want to walk through next, one that I think maps onto this more closely than people expect, and it might change how you think about the next few weeks of your own life. There's a moment in Elijah's story where he's about as alone as a person can feel. He's just had this massive, dramatic confrontation, one in a way that should have felt triumphant. And then, immediately afterward, he's running for his life, completely isolated, sitting under a tree wishing he could just stop existing for a while. Not a metaphorical loneliness, an actual physical, geographic isolation, days away from another human being who knew him. And what happens next isn't a dramatic rescue. It's quiet. He sleeps. He's fed. He sleeps again. Then there's this moment where he's told to go stand on a mountain, and something significant is about to happen, and the text builds it up. Wind, earthquake, fire, all this loud, dramatic stuff. And after all of that, it specifically says God wasn't in any of it. He was in something else. A quiet voice, almost a whisper, easy to miss if Elijah hadn't been paying close attention. I think about that sequence a lot because it maps onto loneliness in a way I don't see talked about much. The most isolated, abandoned feeling stretch of Elijah's whole story is the exact stretch right before the most important, intimate moment of communication he experiences in the entire narrative. The isolation wasn't a sign he'd been forgotten. It was the quiet before something that required actual quiet to be heard at all. If you've felt isolated lately, genuinely unseen, not just temporarily alone, but unseen in a way that's lasted, I don't think that's necessarily evidence you've been abandoned. Sometimes the loudest, most crowded seasons of life are actually the hardest ones to hear anything real in. And sometimes the quiet, lonely stretch is exactly where something important finally gets through, because there's finally enough silence for it to land. That doesn't make the loneliness comfortable while you're in it. Elijah didn't enjoy sitting under that tree wanting to disappear. I'm not telling you to enjoy this either. I'm telling you that the order things happen in matters, and right now, you might be in the quiet part that comes before something, not the empty part that comes after everything's already over. Here's the part I think you actually came for, though. The thing underneath all of this. What does it actually mean for something to be unseen by people but seen by God? Because I think that phrase gets used so often in spiritual content that it's lost its weight, and I want to give it back its weight for a second. Being seen by God isn't a vague spiritual platitude meant to fill the gap where actual human connection should be. I don't want to use it that way, because that would be dishonest and a little insulting to how real your need for human connection actually is. You need people. That's not a lack of faith. That's just being human. And nothing in this message is asking you to settle for less than real, embodied connection with other people. What I mean by being seen, in this specific context, is something more like this. There is no version of your loneliest moment that happened without witness. The night you sat with the feeling that nobody actually knows you, that wasn't unwitnessed. The version of you that exists when nobody's watching, when you're not performing for anyone, when you're just quietly yourself in your own space. That version has never once gone unseen, even on the nights it felt like the most alone you've ever been. That doesn't erase the ache for human connection. It's not supposed to replace it, but it might take some of the edge off the specific fear that you're fundamentally invisible, that nobody, not even something larger than the people around you, actually registers your existence in any meaningful way. You're not as unseen as the loneliness has been telling you. Let me say a few things plainly, because I think they need to land directly instead of just being implied. You are not forgettable. The specific feeling that you disappear and nobody would notice that feeling is loneliness talking, not an accurate read on your actual impact on the people around you. People notice more than they say. People remember more than they show. The absence of constant, visible affirmation doesn't mean the absence of real care. You are not behind on connection just because it hasn't happened yet the way you pictured it. Some people build deep friendships early. Some people build them later, after a long stretch that looks like nothing, because they had to first become someone capable of receiving that kind of connection. There's no universal schedule for when real connection is supposed to show up in a life. You are not too much, and you are not too little, for the right people to actually want to know you. The specific people who haven't stuck around, who didn't reciprocate the depth you offered, that's information about fit, not about your worth. It's painful information, but it's not a verdict on you as a person. And you are being prepared for connection right now, even in the isolation, the same way Elijah's quiet, isolated stretch came right before the most intimate moment of his story. The loneliness isn't necessarily the end of your story. It might be the part right before the part you've actually been waiting for. There's something about loneliness that doesn't get said plainly very often, and I want to name it here, because I think you've probably felt it without anyone putting words to it for you. Nobody tells you that loneliness can exist inside a marriage, inside a close family, inside a packed social calendar. People assume loneliness only happens to people who are physically alone, and that's just not accurate. You can be surrounded by people who love you in their way and still feel like the realest parts of you have never actually been witnessed by anyone. That kind of loneliness is somehow harder to talk about because from the outside, your life doesn't look lonely at all, and explaining the gap feels almost ungrateful. Nobody tells you that loneliness makes you doubt your own likability, even if you were confident before. After enough time feeling unseen, you start to wonder if maybe you're just hard to connect with. Maybe there's something about you that keeps people at a distance without you fully realizing it. That doubt creeps in slowly, and it's rarely accurate, but it feels completely convincing from the inside. And nobody tells you that loneliness has a way of making you stop trying, quietly, without a dramatic decision behind it. You don't consciously decide to give up on connection. You just stop reaching out as much, stop accepting invitations, stop putting yourself in situations where you might be disappointed again. It's a slow withdrawal, not a sudden one. And it can sneak up on you until one day you realize you've isolated yourself further than the original loneliness ever did on its own. If any of that's familiar, it's not a flaw in you. It's just what loneliness tends to do to a person over time, and naming it honestly is sometimes the first step toward it loosening its grip even slightly. There's a stretch in David's life, after he's already been anointed for something significant, where he's running, hiding in caves, completely cut off from the life he expected to have by that point, betrayed by people close to him, hunted alone in a literal cave with nothing but a handful of men who were themselves outcasts and runaways. That's about as isolated as a life can get, not metaphorically, but literally hiding from people who wanted him dead. And it's in that exact stretch, hiding in caves, that some of the most raw, honest writing attributed to him emerges songs about feeling abandoned, about crying out into what felt like silence, about wondering if anyone was actually listening. Those aren't polished, composed expressions of faith. They're the writing of someone genuinely isolated, genuinely uncertain, putting words to exactly what you might be feeling right now. What strikes me is that those cave years, the loneliest stretch of his life by most accounts, became some of the most enduring, most relatable writing in the whole of Scripture, read and quoted by people in their own loneliness for thousands of years since. The isolation didn't disqualify him from significance. In some strange way, it became part of what made him significant, because it gave him something honest to say to other people who'd eventually find themselves in their own caves. Let me give you something practical here, not just an encouraging idea that fades once this video ends. Stop measuring your worth by how quickly people respond, or how often they reach out first. That's a brutal way to measure connection, and it's not accurate either, because plenty of people who care about you are just bad at initiating, busy with their own lives, or simply not as expressive as you'd want them to be. The frequency of contact isn't a perfect proxy for the depth of care. Be willing to reach out first, even when it feels risky. Loneliness convinces you that reaching out is pointless because people will reject you or ignore you. Sometimes that happens. But sometimes the only reason a connection never deepens is that nobody made the first move, and you can be the one who does, even if it's uncomfortable. Let yourself be known in small doses before expecting deep connection all at once. Real closeness almost always builds gradually, through small moments of honesty repeated over time, not through one big vulnerable conversation that suddenly fixes everything. If you've been waiting for one dramatic moment of being truly seen, it might help to lower that expectation and look for small moments instead. Pay attention to people who already see more of you than you give them credit for. Sometimes the loneliness narrative makes you overlook actual care that's already present, just because it doesn't look like the specific kind of connection you were hoping for. Someone checking in occasionally, someone remembering a small detail about your life, someone showing up in a quiet way. These count, even if they don't feel like enough on their own. And give yourself permission to grieve the connection you haven't had yet, without letting that grief convince you it's never coming. Both things can be true. This has been genuinely hard, and it's not necessarily permanent. There's a woman named Ruth whose story includes a kind of loneliness worth mentioning here, widowed in a foreign country, with no family of her own left except her mother-in-law, completely cut off from everything familiar. She made a choice in that isolation that looks, on its surface, almost reckless. She stayed with someone instead of going back to whatever safety she might have found elsewhere, choosing connection over the easier, more isolated path. What's striking is that her loneliness didn't resolve through some dramatic rescue. It resolved slowly, through ordinary acts of loyalty and showing up day after day in a field that wasn't even technically hers to work in. The connection that eventually became the center of her whole story started in the most unglamorous, repetitive circumstances imaginable. Not a sudden friendship, but a slow accumulation of small, faithful moments that built into something real. If your own loneliness has felt like it's stretching on without resolution, Ruth's story doesn't promise you a dramatic rescue either. It suggests something quieter that connection often builds through ordinary persistence, showing up honestly to the people and situations in front of you, even when it feels small and unremarkable in the moment. There's a distinction worth making here, because I think it actually helps practically, not just philosophically, the difference between solitude and loneliness, even though they can feel identical from the inside on a hard night. Loneliness is the ache of wanting connection and not having it. Solitude is being alone and being okay with it, sometimes even finding something valuable in it. The same exact circumstance, sitting by yourself on a quiet evening, can be either one, depending on what's happening inside you while you're sitting there. Most people move between both states without realizing which one they're actually in at any given moment. Here's why this matters. If you're in loneliness, the goal is connection, and it's worth actively pursuing that, reaching out, trying, risking rejection sometimes to get it. But if what you're actually experiencing has shifted into something closer to solitude, a quieter, more settled kind of alone-forcing connection you don't actually need yet can sometimes interrupt something valuable that's happening in the stillness. Learning to tell the difference, even roughly, can help you respond to your own alone time more accurately, instead of treating every quiet evening as a crisis that needs immediate fixing. I'd guess most of what you've been feeling is genuinely loneliness, not solitude, an actual ache for connection that hasn't been met, not a peaceful kind of alone you've chosen. I'm not trying to talk you out of that ache or suggest you should just learn to enjoy being alone instead of wanting people. You should want people. That want is healthy and human. But I do think it's worth occasionally checking in with yourself about which one you're actually experiencing in a given moment, because the response is different. Loneliness asks you to keep trying for connection, even when it's scary. Solitude, on the rare occasions it shows up, might actually be asking you to just be present with yourself for a bit, without treating it as a problem to immediately solve. There's also something worth saying about the specific loneliness that comes from being misunderstood, rather than just being physically alone. You can have people around you and still feel desperately lonely if none of them actually understand the real shape of who you are, if you're constantly translating yourself into a version they'd accept, rather than being known as you actually are. That kind of loneliness is sometimes the hardest to name, because from the outside, you look connected. The disconnect is invisible to everyone except you. If that's closer to your experience surrounded by people but still feeling fundamentally misunderstood, the path forward usually isn't more people. It's deeper honesty with the people already in your life, even though that's genuinely risky. Letting someone see a more accurate version of you, even just one person, even just slightly more than you've shown before, is often how that specific kind of loneliness actually starts to ease, not through more contact, through more truth in the contact you already have. I know that's easier to say than to do. Vulnerability with someone who might not respond well is a real risk, and I'm not pretending otherwise. But the alternative, staying perfectly hidden to avoid the risk of rejection, guarantees the loneliness continues, while honesty at least gives you a chance, even if it's not a guaranteed one, of being actually known by someone. If you're wondering what to actually watch for, here's a few small, easy-to-miss signs that your own loneliness might be starting to shift, even before any major connection arrives. You start noticing small moments of warmth you might have dismissed before, someone remembering a tiny detail about your life, a brief conversation that felt more genuine than usual, a text that came at the right time. These were probably always happening around you in small doses. You're just finally in a place to register them as real instead of brushing past them. You stop assuming the worst before reaching out. Where you used to brace for rejection automatically, you start extending small invitations or small honesty without immediately expecting it to fail. That shift usually means something underneath has started to heal, even before any specific relationship has actually deepened. You find yourself less interested in performing for people who weren't really watching anyway. There's a kind of relief that comes from no longer trying so hard to be liked by everyone, and instead focusing your energy on being known by a smaller number of people who actually matter. That shift, quiet as it is often one of the clearest signs that the lonely season is starting to loosen its grip. And you start being a little more honest, even in small ways, with the people already in your life, letting a little more of your actual self show through rather than the curated version you've been presenting. That honesty, even in small doses, is usually what starts to attract the kind of connection you've actually been wanting, rather than more surface-level interaction that leaves you feeling just as unseen as before. None of these signs are dramatic. None of them make for a good highlight reel, but they're often the actual early evidence that something's shifting, well before an obvious friendship or relationship confirms it. Watch for the quiet signs, not only the big obvious ones you've been hoping for. I also want to say something about self-compassion here, because loneliness has a way of making people unusually harsh with themselves, as if the isolation itself is evidence of some personal failing that needs to be punished with extra criticism. If you've been hard on yourself about this, about not having more friends, about struggling to connect, about feeling like you're somehow doing life wrong because you're lonelier than you'd like to be, I want to gently push back on that harshness. Being lonely doesn't mean you're failing at being a person. It usually just means your circumstances, your season, your specific path haven't yet intersected with the connection you're looking for. That's circumstantial, not a character flaw. Treating yourself with the same gentleness you'd offer a friend going through this exact same thing might actually help more than any amount of self-criticism ever could. If any part of this message has felt like it was speaking directly to your specific loneliness, the ache of feeling unseen, the tiredness of reaching out without much coming back, the quiet fear that maybe this is just how your life is going to be, I don't think that's a coincidence. I think you needed to hear today that you haven't been left out of the order of things, even on the days it felt like you had been completely forgotten. I want to say something about comparison here, because it sneaks into loneliness faster than almost any other feeling. Scrolling through people who seem to have effortless friend groups, easy relationships, constant company, it's easy to feel like everyone else got handed connection while you've had to fight for scraps of it. That comparison is rarely fair, because you're seeing curated highlights, not the actual texture of someone else's relationships, which might be far lonelier underneath than they appear. Let your own timeline for connection be your own timeline, not a copy of someone else's social calendar, not a competition against how connected other people appear to be. Whatever connection is actually coming for you will look like yours, built around your specific story, your specific isolation, your specific readiness. Not a copy of somebody else's friend group that happened to form more easily. I want to come back to the title of this message now, because I don't think it's been fully unpacked, the idea that everything is happening in divine order for you specifically. Order doesn't mean every single moment makes sense on its own. It means the sequence, taken as a whole, is moving somewhere, even when individual pieces look disconnected or even painful in isolation. The lonely stretch you're in right now might be one piece of an order that includes connection you haven't met yet, growth you haven't noticed yet, a version of yourself that's being quietly built specifically so that the connection, when it arrives, actually lands and lasts. This isn't a guarantee that a specific person shows up on a specific date to end your loneliness. I can't promise you that, and anyone who promises you something that specific is overselling a certainty nobody actually has. What I can say is that loneliness, however long it's lasted, doesn't automatically mean you've been left out of the order entirely. It might just mean you're in an earlier part of the sequence than you wanted to be. You are not unlovable. The specific fear that something's wrong with you. That's why people don't stick around, that fear isn't an accurate read on your worth. It's what loneliness tends to whisper to almost everyone who experiences it long enough, regardless of how genuinely lovable they actually are. You are not behind on connection just because it hasn't arrived on the timeline you expected. Some of the deepest relationships in people's lives show up later than anyone expected, often right after a stretch that looked like permanent isolation. You are not too far gone for real connection to still happen. No amount of loneliness, however long it's stretched, places you outside the reach of being known. Long, isolated stretches have ended in real, lasting connection before, more times than anyone could count, for people who felt just as unseen as you might feel right now. And you are being prepared, even in this quiet, isolated stretch, for connection that will actually mean something once it arrives. Not because you have to earn it through suffering, but because the version of you that's being built in this loneliness might be exactly the version capable of receiving and holding on to something real once it shows up. If any part of this has actually reached you, here's something small you could do. If you're choosing today to believe that this loneliness might be part of an order you can't fully see yet, that you haven't been left out or forgotten, type, "I receive this," in the comments below. Not because the words change anything by themselves, but because naming what you're hoping is true has a way of making it feel a little more solid. And if this gave you even a small measure of comfort, leave a like on this video. Someone else out there tonight is sitting in their own version of this exact loneliness, wondering if anyone actually sees them. A like or a share is sometimes the thing that puts this in front of them at the right moment. If you know someone who's been quietly isolated lately, even if their life looks fine from the outside, share this with them, just quietly, the way you'd pass along anything that helped you. And if messages like this matter to you, consider subscribing for more honest, grounded reminders. Not because subscribing fixes loneliness, but because having a steady source of encouragement during an isolated season genuinely helps. Before we close, a few final things, plainly. You have not been forgotten in this loneliness, even on the nights it felt like the most isolated you've ever been. What's felt like being unseen by everyone might actually be the quiet part of a sequence that hasn't finished unfolding yet. That doesn't erase how hard this has been. It just means the ache and the order might be sitting in the same room together the whole time. Whatever you've been carrying through this, the quiet ache of feeling unseen, the doubt about your own worth that loneliness keeps whispering, the tiredness of reaching out without much coming back, set some of it down tonight. Just for tonight. Let tonight be the night you remember that being unseen by some people has never meant being unseen by everything. There's a version of your life ahead that includes real connection, even if you can't picture exactly what it looks like right now. You were never meant to see the whole sequence from where you're standing. You were only ever meant to keep showing up honestly to today. You have not been forgotten. Say that slowly, the way you'd say something you actually wanted to believe. Not on the loneliest night of this stretch. Not on the morning you wondered if anyone would notice your absence. You weren't forgotten in any of it. You are not too much, too quiet, too complicated, or too anything for real connection to eventually find you. The isolation you felt isn't a verdict on your worth. It's a chapter, not the whole book. You are being prepared, even now, in this quiet stretch, for connection that will actually mean something once it arrives. Your story is not finished. What's ahead of you hasn't stopped being prepared just because it hasn't arrived yet. So breathe. One more time. You've made it through every lonely day so far. That's not nothing. If this message has spoken to where you are right now, type "I receive this" in the comments below and take the next step, whatever that looks like for you today. You have not been forgotten. Everything is still happening in order, even the parts that feel like silence.